hi, I'm Farah Katuna. I'm the Executive Officer of Sociology for Women in Society, and welcome to Plenary 3. And I will turn things over to Mignon to introduce our final plenary. Thank you.
Thank you, Barrett. Hello, everyone. This is our final evening. We've had just a whole month of events to celebrate 50 years of SWS. And I hope that we leave here feeling energized and ready to move forward in our next 50 years. For this final plenary session, I thought it appropriate to ask hard questions about the work we need to do to continue to grow as a feminist institution. And so here we're going to emphasize 3 areas, but there are other areas that anyone can speak about, but the ones that I have thought about are gender non-conforming, non-binary, and trans scholars, and how to make their experiences and sociological research on these areas visibly important to the organization and beyond. Tensions around inclusion relating to race and ethnicity and transnational and migration status. Looking intersectionally when considering the experiences of people in SWS and in society. And issues around social class and the needs of scholars with limited means, as well as scholars from under-resourced institutions, recognizing elitism in the academic hierarchy and what that might mean for access in feminist organizations. So these ideas were developed with the program committee. They're not just my ideas, but the program committee developed these ideas. And the program committee has prepared a series of themes and questions for the panel tonight. And as with our other plenaries, instead of a moderator, we'll be guided by a celebrant provocateur. As the celebrant, the person officiates, and as a provocateur, they may trouble the waters, so to speak, by asking stimulating questions or responding to questions in unexpected ways. They will keep all of us on our toes. Okay, so our final celebrant provocateur is Zakia Luna. Zakia is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and affiliated with the Department of Feminist Studies. She's the author of Reproductive Rights as Human Rights, Women of Color, and the Fight for Reproductive Justice, published this in 2020 by NYU Press. And she's also a member of our 2021 program committee. And I would like to thank her for all the work she's done in that capacity. And I'm now turning over this plenary to Zakia, leaving us all in her very capable hands.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mignon. I'm excited to be the celebrant provocateur for this final plenary of the Winter SWS 2021 meeting. I'm going to give like very brief bios of all of the panelists, like 2-sentence bios, because you can find them online in all sorts of spaces. And also we have just a wonderful set of questions that they have been mulling over for weeks. And we want to make sure we get to that. And also there'll be some time at the end to hear from SWS members about some of your thoughts about the questions and answers. So first, I'm going to briefly introduce Drea Boyles, who right now is a visiting associate professor of sociology and Africana studies at Tulane, and is also SWS secretary, as many of you know, and is involved in all of the things. Next, we have S. Crawley, and they are an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at University of South Florida, winter meeting program chair for SWS, which has involved so many things, and also incoming chair of the ASA's section on sex and gender, which is the largest section of ASA.
I'm actually the outgoing chair.
Outgoing.
Just did the work, but thank you.
That's just like, not another year. Not another year. Daniel Larson, assistant professor of sociology at Swarthmore College and past chair of Sociologists for Trans Justice, is here with us as well. We have Vaishali Patil, Associate Professor of Sociology, Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University, and is on Publications Committee. And we also have Marissa Salinas, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology at UC Santa Barbara, with a doctoral emphasis in the Department of Black Studies. And last but not least, we have Elroy Windsor, Professor and Chair of Sociology, University of West Georgia, and they are a past member of the Gendering Society Editorial Board. Okay, so the first theme that we are focusing on today, and yes, I did print this out, I'm a little old school. The first theme is focusing on meaning of SWS for the discipline of sociology, classes, research, activism, and public sociology. And the first question really gets at, what is significant about having a feminist organization within the discipline of sociology? What has SWS contributed to the discipline, including in research and teaching of gender, feminist topics and methods beyond the topic of gender, advancing scientific knowledge, professional organizations like the American Sociological Association, and also possibly to public sociology and social activism over the years. So our first responder, S.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introductions, Zakia. It's wonderful to be with this group of folks tonight. I want to say a quick thank you again to Mignon. It has been so much fun working with you and an honor to be asked to work on the program committee. So thank you so much for that invitation. I've really enjoyed the teamwork that we have engaged to put together this wonderful meeting. And as I've sat through all these Zoom meetings over the past several days, I look at this crowd of folks and I think to myself, the brain trust that would have been a room but is actually in a Zoom gives me so much optimism for where we're going to go. So we'll handle some hard questions, but I want to start with optimism. Okay, my students will know that I almost invariably start questions from epistemology, and that's where I'm going to go tonight, right? Feminisms, critical race theory, and queer color work in particular are stand out for putting people back in the production of knowledge, right? Quite in opposition to a sort of standard positivist style of work where, objectivity takes people out or treats people as objects. Feminisms write people back into research as researchers and as people living in the world, not as disembodied observers, both in how we do it and how we work with people. In other words, lived experience matters. So I think about drawing from folks like Sandra Harding's strong objectivity, where the positionality of the authorship matters. Patricia Hill Collins' refusal of dualisms by focusing us on a both and rather than an either or characteristic where the world is seen as multiple and perspectival. Donna Haraway's cyborg metaphor, where we're always inextricably virtual and material, right? And then Karen Barad's refocus on materialism subsequent to postmodernism, and specifically work that I'm interested in, Dorothy Smith's sociology for people, right? And that orientation to our work, our scholarship, our activism, our organization, the way we organize as a feminist organization matters. So I want to argue that SWS was public sociology before Michael Burrow created the term. That we've been doing public sociology. In fact, that's what we've been doing all along. The purpose has always been feminist activism. It's always been about creating change. And that I will go so far as to say that Michael Burrow was late to the game on that one. But I am glad to see that sociology, writ more broadly, has taken up that task. So thinking about SWS then as an organization, I know many of you are on Facebook. I don't know if some of you saw the meme that's been floating around the last few days. I think it was Gina Longo that put it out there. I stole it from her, so it's on my Facebook feed. But it's basically a picture of a person wearing really dark suit, looking very sort of small and and sort of stayed, and then a person sitting next to them who's just fabulous with pink feather boas just sticking off in every direction, right? And the pink feather boa person is labeled as SWS, and the person in the dark suit is labeled as ASA, right? It says so much. It says so much about the way the feminist perspective, starting with epistemology and working all the way down through methodology and methods, amplifies our passions and encourages collegiality, and does that, I think, in ways that work against the kind of the standard academic practice of dueling over reputations, but rather working in collaborative ways to support each other's work. I find it quite the paradox that often at ASA, while we study and critique bureaucracy and elitism, there are moments in ASA where that organization trades on bureaucracy and elitism, right? And I think in many ways that can feel soul killing. And so what I think is different about SWS is the posture of collegiality and collaborative work, wherein we're trying to work against hierarchy and the individual model of success. And I think that's something that's different about SWS than any of the other professional organizations that I've been linked to, which doesn't mean any of the other professional, I haven't been working with all of them, there may be others, but I think even often at times working in the sections, you know, the competitiveness overrides collegiality, and that's something very different about SWS. And I want to argue that SWS is founded in feminisms, including Black feminisms, womanisms, Chicana feminisms, transnational feminisms, and queer of color work, and that each of those emphasize the lived body and collegiality. And I'll leave it there.
Ooh. That's a lot. Do any of the other panelists want to share something in response to that question?
Well, does anybody really want to go after that?
Does anybody have their pink feather boa with them? That could help.
You know, I was thinking about this question, and what everything S said, you know, I obviously completely agree with that. And I was also thinking about the feeling I get when I'm at ASA versus when I'm at SWS, right? And it's a palpable the difference, right? I mean, to me, the significance of a space like SWS is that there's already a culture of we are self-reflective and we are self-critical, right? We are continually trying to do this sort of grappling with multiple forms of power relations. And we're trying to apply that to everything we do, our scholarship and our teaching and our interpersonal relations and our identities. And I think that you know, that I have not encountered that at another conference, at another professional conference space. So I think that's what SWS brings, or that's the meaning of SWS in the discipline. And I saw that meme, and I agree. It was an awesome meme.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, yes.
I was gonna go, Zakia.
Yeah,
Do we have
you.
time? We can move on if we need to.
Yep. Go, Drea.
There's always time for Drea.
Oh gosh, no pressure. So yeah, I was gonna say, I think, you know, the benefit for me, or thinking broadly for a feminist organization, is that it allows for more space and opportunity to call attention to, you know, the rigidity of these hierarchies, you know, to challenge history, to challenge this ongoing and pre-existing disinformation campaign that have left countless people from one extreme to the other invisible or altogether erased. And so as many places and spaces where we can challenge that and call attention to folks and highlight marginalized people, you know, intersectionally and otherwise, is important. When we speak to SWS particularly, what that has, at least the benefit that I see in that, is that, ASA and many other organizations can be incredibly overwhelming, and very elitist, to say the least. So I'm sort of repeating some of what I've already heard, but I think what is very helpful about SWS is that it's smaller and intimate. And so you have space to navigate and kind of get your bearings, and then create networks in a less, in a way that is not as intimidating, so to speak. But to be able to do that and kind of navigate, smaller inroads, and to then strategize within those inroads to sort of make up the difference, or to at least create opportunities where you feel more comfortable, or you feel more involved, or at least emboldened to sort of step out, so to speak, when it comes to the larger organizations.
Great, thank you. So this next question gets at, feminism, as a paradigm and a politics, right? And therefore has to grow along with various changes in society. And so what are some ways you think SWS can grow in its thinking and expressions of feminism?
I wanted to start by just saying thank you to Mignon and the program committee for asking me to be a part of this conversation. I'm deeply grateful. So I think that we have already seen some important growth, right? The sort of generic cisgender woman, I think that's signified by the moniker sociologist for women in society, has been expanded, has been made much more diverse, right? Since the time of its inception. And SWS is also an organization in which people of color and queer identified folks and others increasingly are finding space and impacting programming and impacting conversations, right? And this is something that's been going on for a few years now, right? Although we all know that this process is ongoing. For me, what are some of the ways that SWS can grow in its thinking and expression of feminism? Something that is, to me, still somewhat a little bit missing is the recognition that we are situated in the heart of empire, and a serious grappling with what that means for our scholarship, for our teaching, for our identities, our professional relations, right? And the privileges that we receive in a global feminist knowledge economy because of that. And so for some of us, what this means is that we may be marginalized in the context of the US Academy because we come from marginalized groups or because we study marginalized groups. But we still need to understand that even as we are marginalized in the US context, we are still privileged in terms of this global feminist knowledge economy, so that our work will be circulated and read and visible around the world in a way in which equally valuable work from other places will not, right? So in English-speaking contexts, but also in non-English speaking contexts, our work is more likely to be translated, right? And so if we're going to be this critical feminist space, I think we have to grapple with the inescapable fact of our imperial privilege. And that privilege is deeply embedded in the structures of knowledge production, right? So Raven Connell talked about this when she talked about how we need to make space for Southern theories. We definitely need to make space for Southern theories. But I think in addition to that, we also have to really critically interrogate our Northern approaches, which are not innocent, right? So we need to think about how empire is the basic infrastructure and architecture of what we do, of the sort of empirical world as it becomes known to us, our theorizing, our concepts, and so on, right? As well as the social life of our work how it will circulate, who will read it, who will cite it. All of those things are shaped by our privileged location in this global feminist knowledge economy. I'll stop there.
I'm seeing a lot of folks in the chat appreciating you lifting that up. I'm curious, other panelists want to engage with that comment or add your thoughts to the question?
I have a thought about the question, but I was hoping I've already talked a lot, and wanted to give somebody else time to talk.
Yeah.
So, if anybody else would like to answer the question, please.
Marissa, yeah.
When I think about that question, I think that SWS, and I think of different feminist orgs in general across academia, I think that we often talk about inclusivity and, you know, bringing in these different marginalized groups and so on and so on. And it's like, that's wonderful. We've gotten to that point, you know, where we are kind of actively doing this. But I think that for me, the type of feminism that the org is rooted in, for me, would have to be an intersectional feminism. And I think that that actually rings differently. It's a difference between let's be inclusive and like bring in more representation per se, versus let's try to have this feminist org that's actually rooted in the epistemologies and ways of being of already marginalized groups. And I think that in doing that, it's kind of, it's inadvertently tied to being constantly interrogating ourselves and doing the type of work that we need to do. And it actually bounces off what the panelists before me just said in terms of interrogating ourselves and really asking ourselves, what types of politics of respectability do we have even internally, even some of these biases and being reflected that we don't really see, that can also act as a gatekeeping mechanism for others who haven't joined, or maybe who have joined but haven't really been integrated into the leadership of the org. But I would say really kind of taking this really conscientious lens of not just inclusivity, but in actuality, really rooting the organization from those that are the orientations of those who are the most marginalized.
Okay, alrighty. And, you know, we warned you all, hard questions. We didn't promise lots of answers. We promised questions and dialogue.
I do have a quick comment before we go on to the next question,
okay,
if you don't mind. I deeply appreciate the comment that Marissa just made, and I think that is very clear in our lives, in the public world, in global politics at the moment. I feel like we're at a very historic moment, and it's a moment that requires deep reflection and calls for everyone to participate in that moment. But one of the things that I want to think about carefully is, as we think about our organization, to be careful to not characterize it somewhat ahistorically, right? To be careful that we characterize it in a way that is true to the work that has been done in the organization so far. Because I've been thinking about if that we want to be careful not to erase or we risk erasing the labor of folks who have participated in the organization. And there have been quite a number of people of color who participated in the organization. So I took a minute or so just to think about folks that I've worked with. I'm thinking of Marlise Durr, Carrie Smith, Vishali Bottle, Mary Romero, Bandana Pertiasha, Denise Segura, Kate Acosta, Josephine Bioku-Betts, Esther Nanglin Chow, Manisha Desai, Margaret Abraham, Pallavi Banerjee. I mean, folks that have been working for 1, 2, or 3 decades with the organization. And I think it's important to name those folks and make sure that because I feel like if we are too ahistorical about talking about our past, we risk erasing that labor. And additionally, there have been quite a number of LGBTQI plus folks who have worked with this organization, again, sometimes for decades. And I'm thinking of just a few: Judy Howard, Amy Wharton, Betsy Lucal, Allison Moss, Dana Britton, Tracy Orr, Amy Stone, Joe Rieger, Tiffany Taylor, Katrina Block, Katie Acosta, Wendy Christensen, Sharon Bird, Georgianne Davis. This is not nearly an exhaustive list. This is just a list of folks that I came up with in a few minutes sitting here. We absolutely must grapple with the place that we are, but I want to be careful not to erase the work of folks who have been participating in this organization by being somewhat ahistorical about thinking about the past. So thanks for that.
Can I hop in there?
Okay.
So Sarah, it's like kudos to Marissa and Sarah, both their comments, and I'm wanting to kind of further that and say that, you know, I grow a little concerned when we loosely use the word we. We need to ... We should ... We ought to ... I'm really careful about that, at least in a critical thinking way, and how that's operationalized, because who is we? I think it matters much that we really flesh that out in terms of, you know, this organization and what this means broadly, you know, across academia and otherwise. When we say we need to do, you know, so granted, you know, in a superficial way, there are some things we can certainly collaboratively do and work together. We're in an organization together, you know, so that makes sense. But I think beyond that, when we start practicing and operationalizing things, not just by virtue of in a winter meeting, not just by virtue of sitting together in a summer meeting, when we leave these spaces and we go into our everyday, moment by moment, minute by minute academy kind of stuff, and it's now time to put all of those checked boxes into motion, I think we really ought to consider, what does we mean? Because from an intersectional perspective, we are always on duty, meaning Blackness and other minoritized groups, other marginalized groups. There is always, like, there's no break, there's no time out. And I don't want to get ahead of some of the questions, but it matters much. Like one of the things, and I won't name drop her, but one of the things my advisor would often say, my chair would often say in graduate school is, who is we, white boy? Like, you know, and so I really want to be careful with that for more reasons than one, especially when we're talking about labor, and be that labor in the past or be that labor moving forward, because some of us stay laboring, as the younger folk would say, stay laboring.
I'm seeing a lot in the chat. Y'all are getting people thinking about a lot of other things, about other possibilities and spaces with SWS. I'm trying to not get too distracted by the chat. I'm actually gonna, we're supposed to switch to theme 2, which is about building and maintaining community in a feminist organization. And I think it's important to keep in mind everything, obviously, the panelists have said up to this point, as we engage with this next set of questions. Okay, well, the next question, the panelists all know the next question is supposed to be, you know, about what has been your most memorable experience of feeling included SWS meeting? And I think before answering that, of course, it's important to think about the discussion that just happened about what do we mean by inclusion in what, you know, and inclusion for what might be the other question someone would think to ask around this. And then the follow-up is around the expansion of how we think about feminist goals in SWS that reflect the differences across race, gender, nation, sexuality, and other points of intersection. So it says that I'm supposed to go first. I did think about this, and I am keeping in mind S's comment about history and erasures of histories, as well as many discussions I have witnessed at SWS meetings. And when I first came to SWS, I could tell there was something going on. So I was like, wow, there's a lot of people who are really frustrated with each other and a whole set of things. But I'm enjoying my time here, right? It was a very specific space though. I've been brought in by Myra. Many people had told me about it, but Myra, always brings a Wisconsin crew, and sharing some Tampa hotel room with 8 other graduate students or something. Had a wild ride to the hotel that included Georgianne Davis, and us getting wildly lost. This is before there were really ride shares. So you just got in a taxi and they said, yes, I know where I'm going. And then maybe an hour later you were there, or maybe you stopped by a 7-Eleven so the driver could get something to eat as you all were trying to get to the hotel. So I will say, actually, I felt there was really some experience of inclusion and connection from the very beginning of getting off the plane and all that, and getting into this very interesting cab ride. But I think it also made a difference that I came with someone who's pretty well known in SWS, and had some other folks who had already been going there. So I was already connected, and I don't think everybody necessarily has that experience, that the first time they go, they feel that connected. And so I will say that was my first and most pretty memorable experience of feeling included at my first SWS. But I'm curious for others, or maybe the answer is, well, still working on feeling included. I think that's potentially an answer some folks might have. So I'm curious for folks. Yeah. Marissa.
Yeah, can I just say, I'm gonna say mine because mine actually wasn't at the meeting. So last year I lost my sister right before SWS, and I wasn't able to make the meeting. And after you lose somebody, immediately you have lots of interests in family and friends and community, and then a month goes by and everything's really quiet and you feel like that loneliness. And I received a card from Barrett and SWS, and it was just offering her condolences and asking for anything that I ever needed, to please reach out. And I can't even tell you what that feeling felt like. Barrett and I, she's been wonderful from the jump. She's been fantastic, but we weren't necessarily that close. And just to know that, I know the work that Barrett goes through every winter meeting, she's exhausted, but the fact that she actually took the time to create a card and send it to me. And so when I read that question, I just had to take the time to just publicly say thank you so much. SWS has been really wonderful, and all the folks that I've met throughout have just been great. And I mean, honestly, I remember my first SWS meeting, it was almost jarring to come into a space that was much more, collegial, and there was a sense of connection between folks. You almost have this very visceral kind of reaction to it because it's so foreign to all of these other academic spaces. But I just wanted to share that with you all. I really appreciate you, Barrett, and I appreciate the larger org.
Can I just piggyback on that just real quickly, that a lot of things happen in the background and Barrett's on top of all of them, but I saw that exact same thing happen this week, right, for someone who lost a family member. So kudos to Barrett. I do have one other little tidbit, if if no one else wants to take a turn just yet.
Are others? In theory, everyone is ready for this question on the panel, but maybe not. And Siri wants to answer the question as well.
Oh, I guess I'll just say then real briefly, I think one of the things that folks in the organization have tried to do is orchestrate welcome. I mean, orchestrate welcome, right? Plan it. Try to think about, not have that be an absent idea, right? So plan who's going to walk up to new faces in the room and try to shake hands and bring people in, and plan the seating at tables so that folks don't feel themselves stuck at a table along the side. The acknowledgement practices at dinner, where the goal is to try to acknowledge any little thing that anybody has done. Have you defended anything? Have you gotten out of a bad relationship? I mean, just to really kind of acknowledge really human things. And I think that the intent toward orchestrating welcome is something that's very different about this organization than I've seen elsewhere. The degree to which people receive it as welcome is an open question. And perhaps that's something that needs to be an open conversation. Are those types of practices being received in the same way? Are people feeling welcome? What are other kinds of things that could be done so that people feel welcome? I think is an open question that continues, that deserves continued conversation.
I could chime in here now, if that's okay. So when I first read this question, I had to really think about it, because ultimately for me, the answer is I haven't. So I'm one of those folks who's going to bring that perspective as somebody who started out in graduate school as a member of SWS because my mentor was as well. And in that capacity, in 2003, serving on a local arrangements committee for the banquet, being treated very poorly by leadership of SWS and not feeling welcome at all. And having that experience come from a leader made me really hesitant to get on board, especially back then in 2003, being one of the only sociologists doing work on trans research as a trans identified scholar. And so as time went on, I started feeling a lot more included in other organizations like SSSP, and even in ASA's sections on sexualities, sex and gender, and then body and embodiment. And then eventually I was invited to be on the editorial board, which was a great privilege, and appreciated the leadership of Joy Misra in that capacity. And then after that term ended, I reflected on that and how it went, and felt that it was very rewarding, but it also was a term of service. And at the same time, didn't get my research published in there, but served to help others get published in there. And was in conversation with many other folks doing trans scholarship, especially trans sociologists doing trans scholarship, who are also not getting published. So for me, it's been a space that I have seen it change over time. I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are in it, and I see the leadership changing in positive ways. So I look forward to seeing what comes, and appreciate Mignon's invitation here to have these hard conversations and be part of that. So thank you.
Can I go? Zakia?
Yes. Who that is?
Yeah, I was going to say that I just didn't have an answer for this question at all, because I don't know that I have an answer to this question. And even though I've been a part of SWS for really, I don't know now how many years it's been. And I don't think it was due to anybody in particular treating me badly. It was just, I don't think that SWS always succeeds in including people, even if that's the sort of stated goal, right? So that's it.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions, and also, again, there's lots of thanks in the chat for folks sharing their experiences of feeling included, but also being, their candor with not feeling included, and dynamics of interactions in space and how that impacts, obviously, how people feel in SWS, as well as I'm seeing in the chat, discussions about things around institutional affiliations, non-affiliations, and the impact that has. So I'm hoping that, yes, in some next questions, we'll get to even more of that. But this next question moves us to, ideas, and actually Elroy leads somewhat nicely into this next question, which is about ideas about how SWS and gender and society can continue to develop in the interrogation and analysis beyond gender. There's a few thematic questions around that. And this first one is, we know that gender is constantly changing, right? As a result of feminist, intersectional, womanist, and queer resistance. And, so how can SWS and our journal, Gender and Society, do a better job in the research, teaching, and politics of trans and gender non-conforming and binary work, and centering and inclusion?
Okay, yeah, so I really appreciate this question, because I think there's always opportunities to do better and to be cognizant of those efforts toward inclusion. And I think a lot of folks who do trans scholarship, I sort of have moved away from that more recently, but had the experience of getting reviewers' comments back that are quite transphobic and betray an anti-trans bias. So what I would suggest is that first, editors bring in reviewers who are well-versed in trans scholarship, a bonus if they are trans themselves. And when reviewers do provide those transphobic comments or transmisogynist comments that betray that lack of knowledge and even lack of trust in that research, that the editor makes the decision to not require those authors to address all of those comments and provide the space for taking the substantive critiques, but not all of the things that are relayed in that kind of review. So that's one of the more important ways of supporting trans scholarship in the journal. But also, this is probably an unpopular opinion, but I did see somebody bring it up in the chat, and it has to do with the name of the organization. And while, I personally will support and rally behind any organization that is for women and support that as a feminist for many decades, if it's going to stay the name that it is, it's not an inclusive space for research that is about all kinds of gender justice. That's not just about women. I think we all know that the history of the term woman and who gets included in womanhood is a fraught history. And I think that trans scholars and their trans-specific research would feel more welcomed and more valued under a different name. Like the Gender and Society Journal has a more inclusive name, in my view. So those are just a couple things, but I'll pause now to hear what others have to say.
I was actually listed as a first responder on this question, but I'm wondering if Daniel has some input. I have some ideas, but I'm wondering if Daniel would like to speak first.
I thought I was going to go when the follow-up question got asked, but I can just.
Well, that's fine. If you don't want to respond to this, I just wanted to make space for the potential for you to respond if you have something you'd like to say.
No, I mean, I think the thing that Elroy brought up is a really, I haven't said anything yet because I haven't really been involved in SWS, in large part because I'm not a woman and I don't do research on women, and specifically I do research on people in general, but I don't do gender research. And so it's not been something that's been until fairly recently even on my radar as sort of a thing I might be interested in. And I think it's a question for the organization whether you want trans men involved, right? Whether that's sort of part of your broader mission. And I don't think it has to be, right? I agree with Elroy entirely that it's very reasonable and valid to have spaces in the world that are for women, right? But if you want it to be a space that is inclusive of all trans people, that's a different space. And that's something to think about, right? I think there's ways to, I've been part of thinking about trans inclusion in a wide variety of spaces, even before I was a sociologist. And I think the question of how to do that in a way that feels true to the heart of what the organization is supposed to be about it's not simple and it's not straightforward, right? You don't want to be, I'm assuming you don't want to be sociologists for society. So then the question is, do you want, if this is an organization whose mission is about everyone marginalized in the gender system in some way, then you've got to figure out a way to encompass that in the name and in the, in the work that you do. But I also think it's entirely reasonable to have a woman-centered organization. But those are not the same thing. And so that's sort of one question. When I've been to one bit of Sociologists for Women in Society meeting and felt very out of place as clearly a man. And I don't need you all to include me, although I think the fact that there is a smaller organization that is dedicated to being progressive and critical and thoughtful and to being centered around issues of gender, like that would have been lovely for me in grad school if I'd known about it, if it had been a place that wanted to include trans men and etc. So I think it's something that could be lovely and is needed, but is not. It's up to you whether that's central to your mission.
I don't know if someone else wanted to respond. If
I was going to go to the follow-up question.
Well, I have one more thought that I'd like to offer up on this, if you don't mind. Particularly, I appreciate Daniel's points, and I think that those are things that the organization really needs to think about in some detail. With regard to Elroy's point, I wanted to respond specifically about Gender and Society, about the journal. Early in my career, I did publish in Gender and Society, but it was clear to me, and I'm talking about in the early, just at the turn of the 2000s, right? It was clear to me that Gender and Society published very specific kinds of things, and it was focused on structural sociology from very mainstream methodologies, right? And so the queer work that I did and the work that I did around trans issues and around Butch and Stone Butch issues, that involved issues around myself and about my own identity. It was clear to me that those were not going to go in Gender and Society. And I have even very recently heard people refer to the journal as cisgender and society, right? I think there's a reason why the journal was originally founded around mainstream structural methodologies, around scientific realism and really mainstream methodologies. And I think the reason for that is because that it was intending to be competing against and gaining legitimacy from mainstream sociology, right? So because gender as a topic was marginalized and women as authors were marginalized, the specific task, the specific strategy was to publish work that is as good as anything that lands in ASR, but do it by way of inventing a journal that's actually going to publish this work. And I think that was actually a stated, strategy early on, because it was fighting this bias of studying gender is already not mainstream, right? So how to do what is mainstream sociology in a way that cannot be denigrated as, sort of insufficient, right? So you weren't going to find autoethnography in Gender and Society, and you still won't, right? I think that we may be at a critical point with the journal to think about what that might mean. Is the journal now solid enough, legitimated enough, respected enough, having been received enough that it can now publish things that are more marginalized? You weren't going to find queer work. I'm not sure how much queer work you still find in Gender and Society, right? Because I think that much of Gender and Society is still based on scientific realism, right? It's still based on mainstream structural, less American-centric, Northern American, US-centric, somewhat more internationalized work, but it still doesn't seem to reflect a variety of methodologies or epistemologies. And I will argue for you, I had planned to answer this question by way of thinking about, I think feminist sociologists have gotten, and especially Gender and Society has been very good about publishing scientific realism, right? And that when we're talking about gender inequality, it's very important for us to use that as a tool to talk about material inequality. There are other tools in sociology, though, that Gender and Society has not been as willing to publish, including interpretive sociology, which we've dabbled in a little bit, you know, based in constructionism. But a lot of gender sociologists, and to some extent, sociologists studying race, will take up, you know, gender is a social construction, full stop. And then it falls back into a kind of language of scientific realism, rather than working from some tools like ethnomethodology and phenomenology that offer other kinds of interpretive ways of talking about how reality is produced in the world. And after spending 4 years of watching this administration and the articulation of unreality and the way in which scientific evidence is taken as, you know, equal to a social media meme, it seems like that in our work as sociologists, we might consider a variety of other epistemological stances, not just studying sort of types of people, but social relations and power relations and identity work and how identity work happens, and, you know, productions of reality. And I think that would be a challenge for the journal, because the journal has not, in my opinion, expanded in that way, and could, but hasn't yet. And my own feeling is that the journal's reached enough legitimacy to be able to do those kinds of things without begging the need for legitimacy from, you know, the sort of centrist of the discipline at this point.
Ooh, lots of thoughts on that in the chat, and then more. And as Daniel promised, there is a follow-up question that Daniel is first up for that we've already started on, but it is, you know, what are some of the obstacles for a true and satisfactory incorporation of trans and non-binary research, politics, identities, and experiences in SWS, Gender and Society, and also how can we continue to dismantle these obstacles? So we've already started along that way, and people have given some thoughts in the chat. I'm gonna let Daniel.
I mean, I said a chunk of what I was going to say already. I think, you know, thinking about the name and thinking about what the, you know, what the mission is one of the big things. And, you know, someone said in the chat also that, you know, when you're talking to somebody who's not a woman, saying, do you want to come to this organization, is tricky out of the gate, right? So I think that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is probably the thing that's true for all, you know, all kinds of groups who don't see themselves as represented as they might like in any given space, is this sort of critical mass issue, right? So if, you know, even if I were to join and start going, you know, I you know, on the one hand, I think it's important to say, like, as a trans man, I'm not that marginalized, right? Like, I get read as a man in most interactions. I'm a white dude. I'm not like in deep need of a supportive organization. Like, ASA looks at me and is totally comfortable with me, right? So like, again, I'm not sure that it's something that even needs to happen. Like, it's not, trans men are not the folks who have the hardest time in the world by a long stretch. And so, you know, the first question is whether that's something that you want to do, right? But I think if you do, you know, figuring out how to get a critical mass in the room is something that's also worth thinking about, so that it's not just one or two at a time who look around and go like, is this a space for me? You know, and that's, again, that's true in all kinds of social dynamics, not just this one. But yeah, and I think I said most of what I wanted to say to this question when I answered before, so I won't repeat myself any more than I have already.
Okay. Anyone want to add to that dismantling obstacles question before we shift a bit? And again, obviously this isn't the end of the discussion, right? Because after the panelists put their thoughts, we're going to broaden the discussion to everybody who's on the call, all 80 something or other, but just want to get their thoughts out there. Looks like Elroy, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah, I'm gonna boost something that I saw Carla Pfeffer put in the chat, which is the representation of trans women in SWS. I think that we all are probably pretty familiar with the ways feminism has had an uncomfortable relationship with trans women and their inclusion in feminist organizations. And so creating a space for trans women to be part of a women's organization is critical. And I think there's a lot of old baggage, a lot of distrust of the ways that trans women might be able to feel included in a space like this.
Thank you, Elroy, for lifting that up. I think we're going to also have to make sure that that at the end that we save the chat, because there's a lot that's going on in the chat and I'm getting individual messages as well. So, but it's great that folks are engaging so much. We have a next set regarding themes. And it continues in many ways. A lot of these themes are very highly related. It says theme 4, ways to promote greater inclusivity within SWS. Like, oh. We've already been having this conversation as well as about the limitations of the language of inclusivity. And this question, I moved for the panelists from a prior section because I thought it fit a little bit better under here, just so that you know. And it's really about, again, sort of how SWS has made space for expansion of how we think about feminist goals that reflect differences in experience across race, gender, economic status, immigration status, sexuality, and points of intersection. And Andrea wanted to start us off in that. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Zakia. And sorry, Zakia
No,
know what I'm
it's
talking about.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
No,
It's interesting.
Anyway, so, so here's the thing. I don't want to be quote unquote Debbie Downer or what have you, but I cannot, I think it would be remiss of me to sit in space like this, in an opportunity like this, given all the hell that is breaking loose around the nation, and just kind of have like this real, kind of bourgeois kind of conversation. And I feel like to some degree, I'm always actively thinking in my mind, while alongside of all the academic stuff that I do day in and day out, right? The way I think about publications and, checking those boxes, the way I think about, teaching and curriculum and all those things and checking those boxes. And but the reality of it is, right about now, it's really hard to kind of keep that in a traditional sense or maintain my thoughts, my critical think, the ways in which we approach that, because people are dying. And people are dying for countless reasons. I think it behooves us as an organization that prides itself in activism and a number of other things to sort of have a conversation that is reflective of actual community engagement. I have heard time and time again from one panel to the next, everybody, from different angles and in different ways dropping the activist label. Right. And I think that is, we are reaching a point now to where that is being dropped so frequently and so often and so incredibly in that it is, it's becoming a fad. It's becoming just the label to wear by virtue of saying, hey, this is and it's not that. It's a lifestyle. One where, again, and I've said this before, where there are constant bodies on the line. We've got some things happening in the world. My thought is this, as I've been sitting here, I'm thinking to myself, me personally, I'm thinking to myself, what would the folks that I interview on the streets, the folks that I capture, what would they think about this exchange? This is the kind of stuff that they hate about us academics. And when I say the kind of stuff they hate about us, because there's never a space or place where we have a real transparent conversation from how all of these different I's we dot and T's that we cross, how that shakes out and plays out in real time in the streets. Regardless of what marginalized space folks operating in. Like what is all of this stuff we do on paper? What does that mean in real time in the streets? Across all these marginalized populations that we're talking about. How do people feel, like truly feel, beyond us saying, I got an extra pub, beyond us, and I'm not knocking anybody, please know that, because I'm right there with y'all. The same process you go through, I go through too. I'm like stressed and trying to get stuff out the door and make sure, so we are in that together. I feel that, I got you. I'm just saying, like, at what point, this is an unfathomable time. And, you know, in the amount of hurt, the amount of pain, I'm sitting in here, y'all, I can't even be like real, you know, I can't hide it in a sense, and I'm probably all off the question, but I'm just saying, when we talk about expansion, I'm just saying that, you know, there was it was understood. I spent the week, inauguration week, I spent that week along with a whole bunch of other folks that could in the house. You know why? Because while the FBI and other folks couldn't understand what white supremacy and all of that meant and the threat of it, there were underlying and informal conversations happening with my community that we were targeted. Don't come out if you didn't have to. Stock up on groceries and don't come out during inauguration week if you didn't have to. So pardon me for a hot second if I can't get in this space and talk about what that means when I'm in an organization surrounded by people who pride themselves in being activists. What does that mean to you? And how does that yet again play out in real time when we get outside of these cushiony offices and these real thick conferences where we get to, you know, kind of chin and grin and pretend and kind of rub shoulders? That's the crap that separates us and makes our work limited. And as an organization, I think we have a responsibility. When we start talking about expansion, expansion cannot begin and end in actual work, just centered around book stuff, centered around classroom, centered around, kind of, where we fall in at, or, in the top ranked journals, or, I get it. But I'm just saying that there's got to be an opportunity in these spaces when we come together to really have a conversation. When you start dropping this activism thing, like, what does that mean? And how does that feel to communities surrounding us, surrounding the universities that we work in, that we spill over into, that we tweak and shake and cause kinds, all kinds of everyday maneuvering, even in their lives, because of expansion? What does that mean? What does that mean when we offer these various courses and things like that, and then the people that are taking the classes are sitting in the classes reeling because they catching hell in their mind about what does it mean to be targeted? What does that mean in real time when our colleagues are getting drugged from one extreme to another, despite the fact we in this meeting name dropping activism? What does your power look like? How is that being used to advance marginalized people in your academic space? That's the kind of expansion I think that is very important in SWS. SWS is a snapshot of the broader society. I had these kinds of conversations with my students, right? And it matters much to me that in 2016, white women voted 52% for Trump, while Black women voted 94% for Hillary Clinton. We the folks like crunching numbers and getting all those interviews and stuff behind and trying to provoke policy changes and all this kind of stuff, right? The personal is political. That's like such a huge deal when we're talking about feminism, right? We're the activist folks coming from the feminist angle, right? 2020, white women, 55% voted for Trump. 90% voted for Biden. I need to understand how those numbers shake out in feminism. While we're in here gathered together and we're checking boxes and talking about expansion, what does that mean? And how does that play out in real time yet again, when we're talking about advancing folks across gender lines, intersectional lines, and all of that? Because I cannot believe that with 70 million people that voted for someone who was anti-humanity, some of those voters up in here are up in this organization. And I'm not gonna let that go and play like that's not the case. They're in our churches or our places of worship. Those folks are in those anti-human people, humanity people are in our classrooms. They're teaching, they are in administration. Those folks are all over the place, and which means that they are also across organizations. Our neighbors, our family members. What does that mean when we talk about feminism and activism? Thank you.
And I hear you really saying, Drea, the broader question of like, what does it mean for SWS to say it's a feminist organization with feminist goals and not be talking about these realities that are so many members are wrestling with, but from very different positions. And what does it look like to have a feminist organization?
Well, we have had anti-feminist policies on a, we just came through an administration that was hell for a whole lot of people.
Yeah, no, I'm bringing it to a broader thing for everyone and thinking about what it means to say that SWS is a feminist organization in a panel that says, you know, we're having, you know, answering hard questions, but has there been enough reflexivity about what does it mean for SWS to take certain stances or not take certain stances? What does it mean within committees? What does it mean within all these spaces? And what are the larger goals of SWS beyond a journal, beyond particular publications, beyond increasing membership? You know, what does it really mean to say feminist organization with all of these things happening, and what? And I think that's a question that everybody on the panel wrestles with in different ways. And I'm seeing a lot in the chat for folks as well, and thinking about also, what does it mean to say we're activists? Right? And that's something that very much gets touted as part of SWS's history. But what does that really look like on the ground in a lot of different ways? So. And we'll have even more space in a couple minutes for others if they want to engage with that question. I do want to move us to thinking about some of the spaces specifically for, and I think this is an area actually where graduate students and undergraduates have done a lot of work to push the organization. What does it mean? You know, what are some of the obstacles for graduate students, folks with limited economic means, to even, you know, in under-resourced institutions to try to participate in SWS in the spaces that SWS creates, how even getting to the space, right? To even have some of these conversations. So I do want to allow some first responders there, Marissa. And I think there was maybe going to be another person and thinking very much about graduate students and other students.
I can start there. This is actually, I was thinking about jumping into what Drea was saying because it fit kind of the same thing. I think that, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Yes, we need to, you know, work on inclusion, and I think we have been fairly successful about inclusion per se, but I think that we have to be deliberate in centering the most marginalized. And interrogating within the organization, within the journal, and so on, how these politics of respectability can act as a gatekeeping mechanism. If you really think about it, like what Drea was saying, it resonated so strongly. And so I always take notes, but I never stay on them. But what Drea was saying in the sense of like, SWS is filled with so much power. So many powerful people are within the org. Most of the folks that are within the org have access to hiring, promotion, making decisions about who's getting a specific fellowship, or what type, within the journal, what type of research and scholarship actually gets to the next level and what that actually looks like. There was a conversation earlier, and we were talking about with the journal itself, are we at a place where the journal can start being more inclusive about, using, autoethnography, or, these non-mainstream, quote unquote, is it respectable enough? Have we hit that level? And it's like, I really would like to kind of really push the org to start thinking about what intersectionality actually looks like in practice. Because we can say all day, oh, we're an intersectional org, but in reality, like I said, we have all of this power. And, I need to be more specific about the we, because that is not, we know that is not just disseminated equally amongst people, even though the labor also is disproportionate given, the demographics of some folks. And so I just really think about, I'm going to be very transparent with you all right now. It's oftentimes even folks within this org, I've had different problems, professional issues, and they say, oh, so-and-so, so-and-so surely is a member, how come you haven't told X, gender scholar about, this problem so they can help you navigate it? And I'm like, that white cis gender scholar that's really rich, that I would never have this type of information, because there's this kind of, again, this kind of disconnect between the theory that, we do intersectionality in SWS versus what that actually looks like when it goes down, like in board meetings, like who are these folks backing up in terms of more, junior colleagues of color, trans colleagues, things like that. And so I think that the organization in itself could be more conscientious of what intersectionality and inclusivity and equity actually looks like in practice. Because we know the theory, we can all talk that talk, but when it comes down to walking that walk, like who's in the front lines, who's taking the biggest hits when we're talking about, confronting social problems that sometimes don't affect all of us. So I'll kind of leave it there. But I just think that a lot of folks in this group have a whole lot of power. So it's like, if we were actually to put, to practice the principles that we preach, then I think that there could be a whole lot of good. And I think it has to go beyond the theory.
Zakia, can I say something?
Yeah, yes.
So I was thinking about this earlier when I started talking about the journal, and then I was thinking I needed to say something again as other people were talking as well. So people have been making this point about, there are a lot of good intentions, and we have all this lovely language and all of that. And we need to walk the walk and all of these things. So one of the things that I think that's oftentimes unnamed, but which inevitably constrains what we do end up doing, is that we're basically we're enabled by this capitalist system, right? So Gender and Society is a journal that exists within a capitalist system. They have the various biases, as was pointed out earlier, but the point is that they're supposed to get a certain number of sites, they're supposed to get a certain number of traffic, right? That's what our publisher prefers, and that matters to SWS because based on how well Gender Society does. SWS has more money. And so, and that means that SWS has the means to fund whatever it is we think we're wanting to do. And so the capitalism piece of this is really important. It constrains, I think, what gender and society ultimately ends up doing. I think it, and I think it puts a straitjacket on a lot of, so that we have often really nice conversations, but at the end of the day, this is the system that enables us. And yeah, so so some of this stuff is systemic and it's beyond our individual intentions. And if we can do what we can do because of this system, then we have to think about what that means, right? And how we can actually how we can address it, right? If that makes sense. Okay.
Are there other panelists who wanted to address the question of thinking about obstacles, including under-resourced institutions or scholars with limited economic means? I will say, I'm pretty sure one of the ways that I got on this program committee is that a couple of years ago, anyone on Twitter, I was ranting during SWS New York, or no, ASA New York, sorry, and about the costs and just being like, this is ridiculous. If I'm at a research institution, research one institution, and these costs are adding up, I'm sharing with how many other people as a assistant professor. This is not a viable system. I'm not sure I'm gonna go beyond next year, which was supposed to be Chicago, because I'd committed to some panels, and that panel that Mignon had put together. And Mignon and I had a friendly discussion on Twitter about the role of conferences and spaces and the importance of these for networks, essentially, right? And networks and opportunities, which some folks are writing about in the chat from what I can see. And that gets to so many questions and realities around capitalism broadly, but also structures of disciplines and even who can be in the space to even raise the question of who's included in this space, right? So many folks who can't come to conferences and spaces and have these conversations or present their work or meet by chance, editors of journals, as happens at SWS, right? Or run into someone in, line at some coffee shop in some hotel, and there you go. And so I know I personally would love to hear more people give their thoughts on this, because it's something that, and I'd say from my personal background, I'm highly cognizant of the fact of where my money goes all the time. It doesn't change that because I've suddenly, go to an R1 institution. No, because I'm very clear on what other bills I have, family, being the most stable person in my family, sort of economically. And that gets to this broader question or comment that others have made about, like, sure, there's a we, but even we as SWS members are differently placed. And yes, some of us, we have power in particular ways, but not in others. And what does it mean to try to create a feminist organization that moves forward scholarship, connections, all of that, well, and is different from ASA, but also still has plenty of power differences. So I'm curious if anyone wants to get more at that sort of follow-up question about overcoming some of those obstacles.
I will say that I can definitely speak to this, especially as it relates to like working class and poor graduate students. It's a struggle. I will first say that, and I will completely recognize that there's an infrastructure in place with SWS that is much more conscientious than any other organization for conference. Like, just to kind of throw it out there, just for other graduate students that might not be aware, and maybe also faculty, that there is childcare that requires a $50 deposit, and then they'll give it back to you. So that in itself is just wonderful, as well as a cost share program up to $300. The problem is that a lot of us don't have the money to front the money because it requires reimbursement. So for those of us who are with limited economic means, we know that maybe in the end we can afford to go once we're reimbursed, but we don't have the money up front. And because of cultural concerns, a lot of us don't have credit cards for many different reasons, right? So that's part of it. I definitely, so kind of echoing what Zakia said, those who have cultural capital and other forms of capital already know that these resources already exist. And so these are the folks that are coming to SWS, taking advantage, doing the networking, meeting all these wonderful people, you know, getting all these resources and whatnot. So it's a lot of folks from multiply marginalized backgrounds that already don't know that these, you know, mechanisms also exist. I think that what could be done, and I kind of will jump on that later a little bit, but I think that there could be more conscientious effort. I'm thinking about per institution, like per institution, specifically when I'm talking about universities. You know, we have senior members who are faculty, and then we have, you know, more junior members that are graduate students. I think that if faculty members that are part of SWS, whether it was an email or something of the sort, was sent to their departments and saying, just so you know, I'm a part of SWS. I know about all these different resources. Come see me if you have any issues or concerns. But there are these different, you know, going into the financial aspects of it. It'll open the door so that multiply marginalized students, which from my context, I know are students of color, first gen students and the like, would be much more inclined to be like, oh, you know, Drea told me that they'll reimburse up to $300, and then maybe they can actually reach out to their institutions and the institution could front the money because they're going to end up getting it back. But I think that there could be kind of a more conscientious effort of more senior members per school, per university, to kind of put it out there that they're the kind of ambassador to SWS, so that students who come from these origins have more in mind of like what the different type of mechanisms of support actually look like.
I'm just going to lift up something that I do see in the chat so that it's on the recording. So that the shift to online has also in some ways made things much more accessible for some folks, right? And that even when people were able to be back in person, that actually, you know, think about what things to keep from this time. Okay. Oh,
Can
yeah.
I add to, and it may have been said, but so again, when we talk about like the overwhelming amount, like we have some incredible people in SWS space. You know, I mean, it's just so much brain power and ability to maneuver across, you know, organizations even, because most of us don't just belong to SWS, right? And so I think that even though SWS is really wonderful about, you know, thinking about cost and things like that, and I'm saying it as not being a graduate student, but I am saying it as being a person that is very conscientious of what my bank account looked like. I'm just saying, you know, it would matter also, and may be important too, to kind of communicate, you know, these same ideas and agendas and sense of urgency across organizations, right? You know, where there may be power shared or some ability to get an inroad or ear. I think organizations have all on some level or another tweaked, you know, given the circumstances surrounding COVID. But I think that generally speaking, because economics, you know, has a trickle down effect, not only in just attending the conference, but then if you're not a member, so one, you need to be a membership, not just as SWS. If you're going to have a viable career in sociology, meaning in an academic setting, then that means you've got to be a member at almost every organization. which also means then you can't even get access to job ads. You can't, unless you are a member, you can't get access to other networks, like be a part of committees, which then means that's going to limit your ability to gain relationships and enroll. It's like this just, you literally hit a wall. And so again, SWS is wonderful, at least as best as I can tell from my privileged spot on council, about, kind of keeping that in mind. But I think it would be very helpful, even as we are working across orgs, to kind of, make sure we keep that in the forefront, even after, post-pandemic.
I just would add on to those two things. I think the, one of the features of being a poorer working class or otherwise from a background where you don't know a lot of people who are in academia is just not knowing what you don't know. When I was in grad school for the first 3 or 4 years, I didn't even understand what a conference really was and why I would want to go to one. So I think there's a lot of, if you want people to be, and then I heard about everybody talk about ASA, and I was like, oh, I should figure out how to go to ASA. So I think if you want people to get the benefits of SWS, it's not just getting professors at institutions to say, I'm from SWS and I can help you, but I think, for a lot of early stage grad students who haven't been part of sort of academic circles before, just having that, like, what is this thing? What could you get from it that's not the things you get from the big, for the sort of obvious things that you get from ASA, and having that, being really explicit about what it can do for you to be part of these sorts of organizations, what you can learn from them. And I mean, for me, the smaller conferences that I've been to are always so much more beneficial in all kinds of ways than the big conference. And so that is something that I didn't realize until I kind of accidentally went to one. So I think part of the work of including people who are not here yet is being really explicit about what it is that's on offer, and that they are invited, full stop. And that can get lost sometimes, because once we've been in this world for a while, it's easy to forget what isn't obvious to people who are outside of it.
Okay, so I'm going to combine the last two questions and any panelist who wants to answer can answer it, because we wanted to make sure that we left about 20-ish minutes or so for audience to unmute themselves and ask questions. And so this is in thinking, this is the 50th anniversary of SWS, as your mugs say, or your mugs that's coming to you will say. So, if you can imagine that you are at an SWS meeting 10 years from now, what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would it sound like? That's the first part. And then, what would be one concrete thing that could be done in the next 12 months to help create vision and bring it into being?
I have some thoughts on that, unless someone else wants to go first. The first thing I wanted to do was circle back to Drea's point about living in a world that is so horrific that every day we feel like we have to, many people do in many different ways, feel a need to protect our physical bodies. And I would hope that almost everybody, if not everybody, in this organization is kind of horrified that 55% of white women voted for the unreality of the former. I've tried really hard not to call that person a president. But I guess in one way, I'm going to start by saying I continually want to bring together our academia with our activism. And it seems to me the question of why did 55% of white women vote for someone who's so racist and patriarchal and just horrible in every way that one can list. That's an empirical question, I think, right? And I think one of the things we add as sociologists is that we have the tools to investigate that. And we should all, I hope, in addition to do that, in addition to doing the activism in our lives, I think one of the tools that we can add is, I mean, that's a project that ought to be pursued academically, and that as academics, that's part of what we can add. But I had, with regard to how SWS can move forward, what are things that can happen shortly? It seems to me perhaps we don't know the activisms that many of us are involved in, and that we could gain from knowing, not academically, but from the activisms that we engage in our world. For example, I've been working with my kids' elementary school on anti-racist activities. And we wanted to figure out how to start a conversation during a pandemic, and just needed something like a simple climate survey. Now, I'm a qualitative sociologist. I can do quantitative stuff, but I don't like to. But there's got to be folks out in the world who have that already. And so one thought would be perhaps folks who are doing activisms, and maybe we ought to be having more common conversations with each other about our activisms in the world, just to learn more about strategies that folks are using. They're not academic. They're just what do we do in the world to help us in our local communities, and can we gain ideas from each other? A second thing, though, that I think addresses another conversation that's been going on throughout these meetings, and that points to Daniel's point as well, and that is, I remember very vividly as a junior scholar that I had no idea what it meant to be a professor. I knew I was supposed to try to get that tenure track position, and I knew I was going to try to have to gain tenure, but I didn't know what that meant. And there was a lot about the politics of the academy I didn't learn until a year after I probably should have known, right? And so I think there's a way in which a lot of junior scholars don't get to know some of the politics of the academy until they're already deeply involved or imbued in it. I didn't know that I was going to have to get tenure again in order to get full professor, right? And that was a very sad thing for me to learn, right? It seems to me that one of the things that we can do, and maybe because we're now in a virtual moment, is to open conversations about the politics of the academy in ways that might help to address the generational divide that has been coming up, I think, in this organization. And what I mean is not mentoring. I think we've tended to have mentoring that's unidirectional. The older people tell the younger people how things work, right? But an actual bi-directional conversation, right? That involves working collegially to think about collective forms of change within our universities. So, for example, a lot of folks talk about like kind of the safety of tenure. And yet just the other day, I think it was, and I'm sorry if I'm name dropping out of turn, I don't think I am, but I think it was Roberta Villalon that was talking about faculty precarity, right? And that tenure isn't always a surety. It isn't always, something one can count on. But we started talking about, and I think it was Jennifer Reich who was talking about faculty strategies that we could be engaging to try to shore up or work against faculty precarity, right? And I guess I'm just thinking, like, do we spend very much time thinking about the politics of the academy and having these kinds of open conversations in ways that might be really tricky to have in our own institutions, because in our own institutions, we're having to name drop and we're having to point at particular folks. But if we're talking across institutions, we can talk about things like, what latitude does a chair have to engage certain kinds of things, or when do we really need to be pointing at a dean? What can faculty members do and at what part of their career? And maybe we ought to be having conversations about faculty members who get a little too comfortable in their space, saying bureaucratically, I don't have that much control. I'm a faculty member, and we need to push folks on that as well. So that's one thing that I'm thinking, perhaps in a virtual sense, we can have conversations that are multi-generational, that allow us to talk about our different leverages that are at the different points of our career, and what kinds of concerns have changed maybe over time for graduate students than they did when I was a grad student 20 years ago. Okay.
Thank you, Wes. And if there's anyone else on the panel who wants to briefly share.
I want to hop in.
Yes, and I'm just going to remind folks of the question. I did put it in the chat so that folks also in the chat could start to answer, as well. But I really do want people to think creatively as well. I'd add this question because what does it really mean to think about the spaces? And I take this sort of in thinking about the movement work I do. If you don't actually practice at creating the space, like you can't magically get there, right? So it's not, what are you going to be, what will it actually look like? What do you have to, you know, create and envision now so that you can start doing things in order to move that there? So, Drea, thank you.
I think that in 10 years, we'll still be talking about this.
Is that how you want it to look?
That's not how I want it to look. I think that there will be some advancement because I think that we are always, I think that there's been some wonderful things to take place, specifically to SWS. I think that change has been slow moving and incremental. If that was not the case, we wouldn't be dealing with centuries old worth of oppression. And so to then think all of a sudden, all of these pieces are going to come into place with some sense of perfection, right? Like perfectly land right within 10 years after there having to be a culmination of bodies on a line in more ways than one to just get us to this point, I think would be unrealistic. So I think these conversations will continue. And I think they will continue for the very reasons we stand in classroom after classroom after classroom, many of us, and talk about the rigidity of these hierarchical arrangements that are not going to just give by virtue of us saying, you know, we kind of need to not be arranged this way. That's just not going to happen. And so there's this constant resistance, right? And we teach that. And so I think it would be intellectually disingenuous for us to teach that and teach, what does it mean to challenge those systems, and then not also be honest about the extent, the pushback, the status quo, what that means every time we work to counter it. I want to also say that Elroy tapped onto something earlier in calling out the rub, the historical rub in feminism, right? And be that with transgender, our transgender members of SWS or the broader society, or non-binary, members of whatever the case might be, that rub, right? And so I think that matters a lot because that's kind of what I was trying to tap into with my earlier comments. I think that as SWS and, as an organization that is working to advance change, I think that we have to be absolutely honest and critical about what we are willing to call out versus not, even if that makes for a real kind of uncomfortable set of circumstances. When I talked about the activism component, sure, there is activism happening perhaps, and I don't know all of it, and it may be happening individually, but what I'm conscious of, sort of in the same spirit in which Elroy called out the historical kind of significance and rub in terms of feminist work and feminism and what that has meant. What I'm also actively conscious of is that there is still bad vibes when it comes to Black women and women of color. Persons of color, just generally speaking, that is still persisting in 2021, and it's still persisting even when we think about the activism sense. So there are people that are actively working, perhaps doing things in their respective places, but what has also been historical is that there has been always a collective of Black women working. It was a collective of Black women and women of color working to flip states from red to blue. It was a collective. I'm talking about the collective work of white women. What does that look like? Not individual, one by one in respective places across the nation. I'm talking about how does the activism, the collective activism of white feminists, what does that look like on the ground in real time as we can experience it in the moment? And the silence is the reason why we'll be talking about this in 10 years.
This is actually the point in which to open it to audience members. So there may be some audience members who do want to respond to that. And how we get to a place where we're not having this conversation in 10 years.
Thank you, Sakia.
Yeah, yeah. We have 70 other folks on this call who are not on this panel. And there's been a lot in the chat. But we'd love to hear from members before we have Mignon close it out for us.
So I'll just risk it and say, Dre, you're exactly on point. And I think people, I think in this organization, my history in this organization, I put it in the comments 10 years ago, we talked about this. So I agree with you, in 10 years we'll be talking about this because it's easier for us to talk about it. It's easy for us to say, we'll get a committee, we'll do a task force, we'll do this, you know, so we need to do something different. It's clear that we do. I've got lots of ideas on that, but I feel like my voice takes up a little too much space sometimes. So I'm waiting to hear on others. There's a lot of folks who have more positional privilege than I do, than Drea does, and lots of folks and really needing some people to take on this task. So, but I just want to say, no silence over here. I'm just trying to not take up too much space. But.
Was that Tiffany?
I think that was
Tracy. That was me.
Tracy, Tracy, I see you now, Tracy. Hi, Tracy.
Well,
yeah.
I'm busy growing food and feeding people. That's what I'm doing. So that's what I do.
Oh, Tracy. Okay, with the tomatoes. Got it.
And I reiterate, you know, thanks for that, Tracy. I'm talking about, and I don't want to be, you know, I'm just saying, I'm thinking beyond our winter and summer meetings. We physically get together, like SWS doesn't begin and end, the agenda, the mission doesn't begin and end when we meet in the summers and the winter, right? So I'm just saying, as a collective, like, as respective, there's this, you know, what does that mean? And maybe that's not a question to answer right away, but I do think that it matters much when we're talking about collective work, you know.
No, I hear you, Drea. And so I'll just say like this, so I know, and I appreciated Daniel saying like, I didn't even know what ASA was. I mean, I got into Michigan and I didn't know it was a good program. Like, this is how, like, I was working at this place called the Institute for Social Research. I'm like, is that good? I don't know. So I've been there. I didn't have any of that social capital. And so what we've done to get here is that we took notes and we paid attention. And beyond the meetings, Drea, we knew like to call on all the cool people and all the great strengths that were here. What are the folks who have all those positions of privilege doing to draw on the stuff that's here, to remember us after these meetings and saying, I need this person to help me here. We need to draw this collective there to do these tasks that are important to bring us all forward. Do we just remember us at meetings to say hello and be nice? Or do we say, here's some resources that can help lift us all up? Because we've done that to get us to this place. But if you all remember all of us in between the meetings, we can be using all these resources as a collective to move us forward.
I've got to believe that folks out there have some thoughts. If we were in an in-person meeting, we'd be so many hands raised. I mean, and this plenary is doing what it promised, which is, you know, hard questions, conversations. And I'm very serious about like, what does it mean? Like, what does it take to not be having this conversation in 10 years? And people have raised some ideas, and I think Drea's raised this question about, it's not just collective organizing for, there's also collective resistance, right? And that's on all sorts of fronts. And there are folks who see that every day and don't necessarily speak up, right? Which is something that Prudence Carter brought up in last night's plenary. So what does that look like to stop that in SWS, in committee meetings, on listservs, in Zoom rooms, I guess? And then,
Hi, everyone. This is
Yeah.
Tiffany Taylor, past president, and I would really like to work on these efforts. I love task forces. I love task forces. So if someone forms one, I would be happy to be on it.
This is Abby. I wasn't going to talk because I do take up way too much space as I have in the chat, but I just wanted to echo what Tiffany said. Also, I was a past president, and it took me a really long time being involved in this organization to figure out that all of the work gets done by committees and that it's not like this invisible consul at top who makes all of the decisions about what we as an organization should be focusing on and doing, and that the committee is open to, you know, theoretically everyone's voices. And I think my first maybe 5 years, I never went on a committee because I didn't know how you got to get on a committee. And so I just want to say to everyone, and especially newer people, most committees are open to everyone. And even if you can't take on any committee work, just being at the meetings and raising ideas to share is really important, because that's where we think, that's where we hear voices. You know, the committees then take up these ideas and look at them. And I think, you know, the working committees is always evolving to be responsive to the entire membership. At least that's the goal.
So if I can jump in, this is Heather Labby. So I'm, can you hear me? Okay, sorry, I'm not on my, I don't have my usual mic. So I'm chair of the Career Development Committee, and I'm thinking a lot about mentoring in various kinds of ways. And I was going to pop in and say, I don't, I hate to say, should we talk some more? But, you know, are there more spaces that we need that are safe enough spaces to have some conversations? And so, as Abby says, a lot of the work happens in committees. I have one of those that I'm leading. And I would love ever so much if people would, you know, if you can come to the meeting, which is in a few weeks, that's awesome. But also if you want to just contact me, that's also great. You don't have to do any work even, right? Just tell me what you need and tell me how you're thinking about things and tell me what's pissing you off and tell me what's exciting, right? And then let's think about how we infuse that into the committee structure, which sounds like super bureaucratic, but like we're a formal organization. But then also into the culture of the organization, right? So into the structure and the culture, we're sociologists, and maybe then we can start to make some change. But I just really want to encourage you and invite you in. I've been around for a while, and I've been at various perspectives in the organization, and you know, I'm happy to take whatever it is you want to give me.
Are there some, oh, good. Sorry, was there newer members or graduate students?
I'll just jump in really quick. This is Wendy Christensen. I just wanted to point out that we're sort of, I think, talking about two different kinds of activism or two different spaces of activism. One internally as an organization for our members, what can we do for our members? And they're not really easily divided, but the other is externally, right? So what kind of activism can we do outside the academy? And I think we've done some, and we could do so much more. And I want us to do so much more. Like earlier this summer, we worked hard to get scholars of color out into the media, to, you know, conversations about social movements. We could do more to support and highlight the work of activists that are inside the organization. and just have more of a media presence. I mean, we have almost 16,000 followers on Twitter, which is really fantastic. And I think we could do more to mobilize that and make our members and the work they do, both scholarly and activist work, which again are not easy to untangle, to make those more visible. So while we're thinking about internal activism to support our members up through their careers, we should also be thinking externally as well. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, Tristan here. So I'm actually a grad student, and I'm also the student representative elect, not elect, student representative now. With that, but hearing this conversation, it does make me think 10 years from now, right? Like the graduate students who are here right now, the undergraduate students who are here right now, what do we want to see the future look like? And also, how can we help our current undergrad and grad students to get to a better place? So where we can still have conversations to move us forward as always, but also, yeah, to doing that. So I don't necessarily have an answer, but I do want to point that this is a really good conversation, and these are hitting some really, really great points that hopefully the student caucus, we can bring this back and work upon this. Yeah.
And hi, everyone. Mary Vernash, Vice President-elect. And I'm really thinking about the piece about, you know, white women and responsibility in terms of anti-racist, inclusive work in these times. And I think, you know, what others have just said, both in terms of the cultural change and conversations, but also sort of the structural pieces that we have to continue to look at and re-examine and shift and change. And, you know, understanding that there's not an end point, like 10 years from now, right? You know, some of the things are going to be the same, and we're going to be called to new and different challenges, right? So I think a piece of making sure that, or doing our best to build a culture that can continue to be responsive to, be listening to, and then structuring the ways in which we have to do our internal and external activism is a really important piece. I think we've got some solid ground to build on, but we have to continue to do that work. So structuring that into our meetings and such is really important.
I think we have time for one more audience member comment.
Could I say something?
Yeah, sorry, with my Zoom the way it is, I don't know who I is, so if you could just say who you are.
Hi, sorry, it's Jennifer Rogers Brown.
Okay.
I had my hand raised, but I realized I don't think anybody sees it. So I wanted to jump in from what many of you are saying. What's really suddenly really ringing to me is I know maybe I could use this kind of help, maybe others could as well, is that right now, because of everything that's been going on, I've been an activist for years. This is how I've been from grad school, undergrad and on. But as things kind of have gotten worse the past, you know, in so many ways, I have found myself really being inspired more by the nonprofits I work with, by the activists in my communities. I've put so much more work into it that now I'm part of 3 boards, do multiple activist work in the community, and I'm on, and plus I'm teaching. My research suffers from doing some of this, and it's difficult to figure out how to balance it. But I try to figure out, I know I could use this help down the, you know, along the way. Does this mean I want to move towards applied work? Does this mean I, you know, I love teaching and my research and I need to focus on that? What does this look like to be an activist scholar? What does that mean to, you know that there are these issues and we want to work on it? So I don't know where that fits in with our work now, or if there's committees already working on that, but I know I could definitely use that kind of conversations with others who are also working on these kinds of multiple projects and feel torn in all these directions.
Thank you all for that. Obviously, we could have hours and hours and more of conversation, but it's pretty late for quite a few folks. And we're at the end of a 4-day or 4-week conference, depending upon how you think about it. I do want to give panelists space if there's a final one sentence or reflection or something that you want to offer to the space before we have our president close us out. You've said a lot, obviously, in a great way, right? You've said so many things that have raised questions, challenged us, and I think that people are also just processing. I know I am, even though I had access to the questions beforehand. I'm still thinking about all the different things that are important. Questions of nation, questions of representation and who gets to do research, whose research is put into gender and society or not, who gets to be on committees, who gets to understand how SWS works or doesn't work. And really, what's the goal of SWS as a feminist organization? And what does it mean to think both within, yes, the bureaucratic structures, but then also well beyond that? And my question is always like, what would it be, what would have to happen for SWS to not even have to exist because we were in a discipline that absolutely valued all this work, all of these people, and there was no longer a question about the legitimacy of doing work around gender, sexuality, about any of this, right? That's what I'm going to be thinking about as I think about all of your questions and comments and how to move that forward in the next year and 10 years.
Can I just
jump
in if no one else is? I just want, I guess the last thing that I want to say is that one of the things that I deeply appreciate about SWS is that this group of folks is willing to host this kind of conversation and willing to host this kind of really difficult space. I think in almost every other academic space, when people start feeling unhappy, uncomfortable, they just bolt. You know, they're done. They worry more about their reputation or something else. And I think these are very difficult things to grapple with. So one of the things that I just really appreciate is the space to sit with difficult things and try to figure out where to go with it and not just escape the conversation because the conversation itself is difficult. So thanks for hosting it. And Mignon, thank you for hosting it. And Zakia, thank you for doing the facilitation and being the celebrant provocateur that you've been. I appreciate it.
Okay. Zakia, is that?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and I think people keep on putting things in the chat. It's hard to keep up with it. Thank you. Yeah, Mignon.
Well, this has been fruitful. It's clear that we have many different ideas about the best path forward. And one thing that I'd like to come out of the larger meeting and this panel in particular, but the larger meeting more generally, is for us to get everything down, right? What are the ideas that we came away with? What are the things that we see? What are the different paths that people have identified for the organization? Mary Patillo wrote a very important paper in I think it was ASR. It was about Black communities and Black politics. And in the paper, she says that there are these different approaches that people take in the neighborhood that she studied. And there's a lot of arguing. And she says that's part of what it means to be part of the Black community. We don't have one voice. We have one goal of liberation. And we have different ideas about the best pathway to that liberation. And part of being part of that community is that struggle, are those disagreements and arguments. And so I'm thinking about that as we talk, right? When we're thinking about the liberation of women and the liberation of all people, and what is the best pathway to that? And people have different ideas, you know, there are different ideas here about what is the best path. And so what I'd like to do in my time as president is to try to compile all of those ideas and think about which ones we're going to struggle with right now. What are we going to do? We won't be able to do everything that we won't be able to do everything that everyone has identified because there are opposing ideas, but we will struggle together. Those of us who are committed to the organization and who want to see something from the organization are going to push for those things. And, you know, we're going to make space because that is what we do. We make space for those ideas, for those perspectives. I remember one of the first questions that Zakia asked about early memories of SWS, and one of my early memories was sitting at a table of a sister to sister group in San Francisco, and I was maybe a young professor or graduate student, and I met Nikki Jones, who is a Black lesbian, also starting out, and I just thought this was such a nice space. And I thought it was nice to have that, and I hadn't seen anything like that in any other organization. There have been times when I haven't felt so included, right? Maybe there's a group of people who don't know me, and so I'm standing on the outside looking in. That's part of being in a group. And you know, people who are more extroverted may have an easier time than those who are more introverted. I tend to be a little more extroverted. I'm drawn to the introverted person, so I might go over to the introverted person. So if you're introverted, stand in the spot where the extroverted person can see you, and then they'll bring you in. So some of those things are group dynamics, and then, you know, there are a lot of things going on, and I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I will say that we want to try to be inclusive. And I know, as you know, sometimes it feels a little too forced, perhaps, I don't know, but we are trying. And if you see something that needs to be done, step up and do it. And that's the best way to get your vision, to have your vision be part of it. Folks who've had bad experiences before, I invite you to return again and try again. If you don't want to, I understand, but just put in the back of your mind, maybe for the future, you might be willing to try again, or you might be open to someone else who wants to try again. And we will, it's messy, and we'll just continue to struggle together. And I appreciate those of you who did, you know, share your perspectives, even if you didn't think that everyone would agree. I appreciate it, because we know where you stand. We know what's on the table. And so thank you very much. And I'll see you on Zoom.